2 years ago, I was sitting in my truck outside a Home Depot at 10:30 p.m., holding a receipt for cabinet hinges I didn't actually need. My wife was at home, probably already asleep, and I was out here in a fluorescent-lit parking lot wondering how my marriage had turned into this polite arrangement between two people who used to actually enjoy each other's company. I'm John Gates. I manage construction projects for a living, coach my son's soccer team when I can, and I can fix most things that break around the house. But 2 years ago, I couldn't fix the most important thing in my life, my marriage to Taylor. And the worst part, I didn't even realize it was broken. Before we go any further, I need to be clear about something. I'm not a therapist, I don't have a psychology degree hanging on my wall, and I'm not some relationship guru who's figured out all the answers. What I do have is a mortgage, 2 kids, a golden retriever with questionable intelligence, and a marriage I nearly destroyed because I was too oblivious to see what was happening right in front of me. This video is based on my personal experience and what I learned through therapy, reading, and a lot of trial and error. If you're dealing with abuse, addiction, or serious mental health issues, please seek professional help. This isn't a substitute for that. What I'm sharing worked for Taylor and me, but your situation might be completely different. Here's what we're going to cover in the next hour or so. First, you're going to learn about the real threat to your marriage, and it's not arguments, it's not money problems, it's not even infidelity. It's something quieter, more insidious, and way more common than any of those things. Second, I'm going to share the most embarrassing moment of my marriage, the moment that still makes me cringe when I think about it. It showed me exactly how disconnected I'd become, and honestly, it was the wake-up call I needed, even though it felt like being slapped in the face at the time. Third, you'll learn about some research from a guy who spent 4 decades studying marriages and can predict with 90% accuracy which couples will divorce. Not based on how much they fight, but based on something else entirely, something you're probably doing right now without even realizing it. Fourth, I'm going to tell you about the vacation photos that changed everything for me. The moment I realized the couple in those pictures no longer existed, and how that realization finally penetrated the fog of denial I'd been living in. And finally, you're going to leave here with one simple question you can ask your wife today, not tomorrow, not when things calm down, but today. This question has the power to restart connection in your marriage, even if you feel like strangers right now. Quick thing before we dive into the actual content. If you're watching this, chances are you're either concerned about your own marriage, actively watching it deteriorate in slow motion, or you're one of those people who enjoys watching other people's disasters unfold like it's some kind of educational train wreck. Whatever category you fall into, I'm glad you're here. If this is your first time stumbling across this channel, welcome to my ongoing therapy session that I've decided to broadcast to the internet for reasons that seemed good at the time. I make videos about marriage recovery, relationship repair, and how to stop being an emotionally unavailable disaster of a husband, all topics I'm intimately familiar with through extensive personal failure. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button if you want more of this particular brand of self-deprecating relationship guidance. I put out new content regularly about the messy, uncomfortable work of fixing marriages, told from the perspective of someone who nearly destroyed his own through sheer oblivious incompetence. No guru nonsense, no pretending I've got everything figured out, just practical strategies from someone who's still in the trenches figuring this stuff out. Also, and this matters if you actually want to see these videos instead of letting YouTube's algorithm bury them under cat videos and conspiracy theories, hit that notification bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the next installment of John Learns Basic Emotional Intelligence Concepts that should have been obvious years ago. Now let's get back. Let me paint you a picture of what my life looked like 2 years ago. Most nights, I'd get home from work around 6:30, walk through the door, give Taylor a distracted kiss on the cheek, and ask what was for dinner. I'd eat with the family while scrolling through my phone, help with homework if specifically asked, and then disappear into the garage until bedtime. The garage had become my emotional bunker, my witness protection program from feelings I didn't want to examine. Out there, surrounded by tools and half-finished projects, I didn't have to think about the growing distance between Taylor and me. I didn't have to acknowledge that we'd stopped having real conversations months, maybe years earlier. I could just fix things, tangible things that made sense, things that stayed fixed once you fixed them, things that didn't require emotional labor or vulnerability, or any of that uncomfortable stuff. But there was this one Tuesday night, completely ordinary Tuesday, nothing special about it at all. I was in my recliner, the one with the mysterious stain that nobody can identify but has somehow earned permanent status in our home, scrolling through my phone, looking at fantasy football stats like they were somehow important or meaningful. Taylor was on the couch, maybe 10 feet away from me, her laptop balanced on her knees with that blue glow washing over her face. The TV was on, but neither of us was watching it. We'd been sitting there for 2 hours, 2 full hours in the same room, barely speaking, just existing in these parallel universes that happened to share the same zip code. And then I looked up, really looked up, not just a glance but actually observed her. She was staring out the window with this expression on her face I couldn't quite read. Sad, resigned, just tired. I had absolutely no idea, and that's when it hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I had no idea what she was thinking, no clue what was happening in her head. The woman I'd married, the person I'd promised to share my life with, had become a complete mystery to me. Here's the thing that made it even worse. I couldn't remember when that had happened. There was no single moment when we went from being connected to being strangers, no big fight or dramatic event that I could point to and say, that's when it changed. It had happened so slowly, so quietly, that I'd completely missed it. It's like those time-lapse videos of plants growing. If you watch continuously, you see nothing, but speed it up, and suddenly you realize massive change was happening the entire time. That was us. Massive change happening in slow motion while I was too distracted by work and fantasy football and whatever else I was using to avoid actually looking at my marriage. Now, most relationship books will tell you the biggest threat to marriage is arguing. Fighting about money, fighting about kids, fighting about whose turn it is to do the dishes. And sure, those things can damage a relationship, nobody's saying they can't, but they're not the real killer, not even close. The real killer is something called emotional neglect, and when I first heard that term from our therapist, I thought it sounded way too dramatic. Neglect? Come on, we weren't neglecting each other. We lived in the same house, saw each other every day, talked about schedules and bills and what the kids needed. How is that neglect? But stick with me here, because this was a complete revelation for me, and it might be for you too. Emotional neglect isn't what you think it is. It's not about ignoring someone or being cruel or dismissive in some obvious way. It's way more subtle than that, which is exactly why it's so dangerous. You don't even realize you're doing it. Here's what it actually looks like in practice. Your wife comes home from work and starts telling you about her day. Maybe she had a difficult conversation with her boss. Maybe she's excited about a project she's working on. Maybe something funny happened that she wants to share. And you're sort of listening while scrolling through your phone, making the appropriate sounds. That's interesting. But you're not really there. Your body is present, but your mind is somewhere else entirely. Maybe thinking about work or that thing you need to fix this weekend, or literally anything other than what she's saying. Or maybe your wife mentions she's thinking about taking that art class she used to love, the one she gave up when the kids were born or when life got too busy. And you respond with something like, "That's nice, honey. Did you remember to pay the electric bill?" You've just communicated something to her, not what you intended to communicate, but something loud and clear nonetheless. Her interests aren't important enough for your attention right now, and the electric bill matters more than her creative fulfillment. There's this researcher who spent about 4 decades studying marriages, actual marriages, not theories about what marriage should be, but real couples in labs having real interactions. He can watch a couple interact for 15 minutes and predict with 90% accuracy whether they'll divorce. Not based on how much they fight or how compatible they seem, but based on something else entirely. He calls them bids for connection, and understanding this concept changed everything for me. A bid for connection is any attempt your spouse makes to get your attention, to share something with you, to connect. Could be as simple as pointing at something outside the window and saying, "Look at that bird." Could be sharing a story from work. Could be reaching for your hand while you're watching TV. Could be asking your opinion about something that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. These are tiny moments, seemingly insignificant in isolation, the kind of thing you might not even register as important. And in each moment, you make a choice. You either turn toward the bid, or you turn away from it. You either engage, or you don't. Here's where it gets interesting, or depressing, depending on your perspective. This researcher studied couples who stayed married and were happy, and couples who eventually divorced. Want to know the difference between them? The couples who stayed happily married turned toward each other's bids about 86% of the time. Not 100%, nobody's perfect, and expecting perfection is unrealistic. But 86%, that's pretty consistent. The couples who eventually divorced, they turned away from bids about 80% of the time. Let that sink in for a moment. The difference between a marriage that lasts and one that fails isn't about having fewer problems or being more compatible or even communicating better during fights. It's about these tiny moments of connection throughout the day and whether you choose to show up for them or not. When I learned this, when our therapist first explained this concept to me, I started paying attention, really paying attention to how often I turned away from Taylor's bids, and the number was absolutely horrifying once I became conscious of it. She'd show me something on her phone and I'd glance at it while watching TV, barely processing what I was looking at. She'd tell me about a conversation with her sister, and I'd respond with a distracted, "That's crazy," while checking my email. She'd ask what I thought about something, and I'd give a generic answer without actually thinking about the question, just providing whatever response would end the conversation fastest so I could get back to whatever I was doing. I was turning away over and over and over, thousands of times, and the worst part, I thought I was being present. I thought because I was physically in the room, because I was making appropriate sounds, because I was occasionally responding to direct questions, I was doing my job as a husband. Here's what nobody tells you about these small moments: they compound. Like interest in a bank account, except this is the kind of interest that works against you, instead of for you. One missed bid doesn't destroy anything, that's important to understand. 2 missed bids in a row, still not catastrophic. You're not going to ruin your marriage by being distracted once or twice or even 100 times. But 1,000 missed bids, 10,000. That's how you end up as strangers in your own home, coordinating logistics but having zero actual connection. That's how you end up sitting in a Home Depot parking lot at 10:30 p.m., holding a receipt for hinges you don't need, wondering what happened to the couple you used to be. Now I need to tell you about the most embarrassing moment of my marriage, the moment that still makes me physically cringe when I think about it. The moment when I finally saw just how far I drifted from the person I thought I was, from the husband I thought I was being. Let me tell you about Taylor's master's degree. She started the program 3 years before this moment I'm about to describe. 3 full years of night classes twice a week, weekend studying at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks and highlighters, working full-time during the day, managing the kids' schedules, still handling most of the household logistics, because that's just how the division of labor had evolved in our marriage. It was brutal to watch. I saw her falling asleep over her laptop at midnight, stressing about papers and presentations, questioning whether she could actually finish or if she'd taken on too much. And I did help, or at least I thought I was helping at the time. I handled more of the evening routine with the kids, put them to bed most nights, made sure they got to school on time when she had early classes. I was supportive, or so I told myself. Looking back now, I realize I was doing the bare minimum to keep our household functioning while she did all the actual heavy lifting. But at the time, I genuinely thought I was being a good husband. The day she really finished, turned in her final thesis, completed her defense, the whole thing finally over, was a Thursday in April. She came through the door at 6:45 with this huge smile on her face, this energy radiating off her like she'd just summited Everest, which, in a way, she had. 3 years of sacrifice, 3 years of pushing herself beyond what seemed possible while juggling everything else, and it was done. "I'm done," she said, and I remember her voice had this quality to it, this mix of pride and relief and joy. "Really done. I turned everything in, it's finished." And I looked up from my phone, where I'd been scrolling through work emails because apparently I couldn't go 5 minutes without checking work emails even though nothing urgent was happening. I smiled at her, said 5 words that I will regret for the rest of my life. "That's great, hun. What's for dinner?" 5 words. That's all it took to communicate everything wrong with our marriage in one devastating sentence. 3 years of her life, her accomplishment, her pride, her joy, and I reduced it to a speed bump on the way to discussing meal logistics. The look on her face, I can still see it perfectly, like it's frozen in my memory. It wasn't anger, which would have been easier to handle in some ways. It was disappointment, this deep, weary disappointment that made it clear this wasn't the first time I'd done something like this. It was more like she'd been reminded once again that her accomplishments came second to everything else in our household hierarchy, to work, to schedules, to what's for dinner. She didn't say anything, which was somehow worse than if she'd yelled at me or called me out right there. She just walked past me to the kitchen, started pulling things out of the refrigerator, and began making dinner like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just completed something she'd been working toward for 3 years. After dinner, she watered her plants, something she'd done every evening for years, this little ritual she had. Usually she'd hum while she did it, these little fragments of songs, nothing recognizable, just content sounds that meant she was happy in that moment, at peace with her little corner of the world. That night, complete silence, just the sound of water running from the watering can, the clink of ceramic against ceramic as she moved from pot to pot. The house felt different, heavier somehow, like the air pressure had changed, but I couldn't quite articulate how or why. And here's the thing that makes me want to climb into a hole even now: I didn't realize what I'd done. Not immediately, not that night, not even the next morning initially. I went to bed thinking everything was fine, that we'd had a normal evening, that nothing was wrong. It wasn't until the next morning, while we were both getting ready for work, passing each other in the bathroom like ships in a narrow channel, that Taylor said something. Very quietly, almost like she was testing whether I'd even hear her or pay attention. She said, "You don't even see me anymore, do you?" "What do you mean?" I asked, and I was genuinely confused. Playing dumb, or maybe actually being dumb, I honestly don't know which is worse. "Yesterday," she said, and her voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been building for a long time. "When I told you I finished my degree, your response was to ask about dinner, and that's when it hit me, the full weight of what I'd done and how completely I'd missed the moment, missed the significance, missed her. I'd been so checked out from her emotional reality that I couldn't even register when something monumental happened in her life. My first instinct, predictably, was to defend myself. Classic male response to being told you messed up. Immediately construct a logical defense, rather than just sitting with the discomfort of having hurt someone you love. I did respond," I said, and I can hear the defensive edge in my voice, even remembering it. I said, "That's great," I acknowledged it. She looked at me in the mirror. We were both brushing our teeth or putting on deodorant or whatever mundane getting ready for work task we were performing, and said something that cut right through my defensive posturing. "You said that's great, the same way you'd say it if I told you I found a parking spot at the grocery store. You didn't ask what my final thesis was about. You didn't ask how I felt. You didn't ask if I wanted to celebrate or if I was relieved or what the defense was like or anything that would indicate you actually cared. You just wanted to know what was for dinner." And then she said something that changed everything, that pulled back the curtain on years of accumulated disconnection that I'd been too oblivious to notice. "This isn't about last night, John," she said, and her voice had this exhausted quality to it, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally setting it down. "This is about the last 3 years, the last 5 years, maybe our entire marriage, I don't know. I can't remember the last time you seemed genuinely interested in something happening in my life that didn't directly affect you or the kids or the household logistics." She wasn't yelling, wasn't crying, wasn't being dramatic. She was just stating facts, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis, straightforward, clinical, undeniable. "I tell you things and you're somewhere else," she continued. "I share something I'm excited about and you nod along while checking your phone. I try to have a real conversation and you give me generic responses that make it clear you're not actually engaged. I've stopped trying to tell you the real stuff because I know you're not actually listening anyway." And the brutal thing was, she was completely right. I couldn't argue with any of it, because when I really thought about it, when I actually examined my behavior instead of just defending my intentions, I could see the pattern as clearly as she could. 2 weeks earlier, she told me about a difficult situation at work, some conflict with a co-worker that was stressing her out. I'd offered 3 solutions in rapid-fire succession, without ever asking how she was handling it emotionally, without asking what it was like for her, without considering that maybe she didn't need my brilliant problem-solving skills and just needed someone to listen. A month before that, she'd mentioned wanting to reconnect with an old friend from college, someone she'd lost touch with over the years. I'd said that's nice, and immediately changed the subject to something about the kids' schedules, like her friendships and social life were less important than soccer practice logistics. 6 months before that, she'd shown me something she'd painted, first artwork she'd done in years, since before the kids were born. I'd glanced at it for about 3 seconds and said, "Looks good," while typing an email, never asking what inspired it, or what it meant to her, or why she'd started painting again after all this time. These weren't isolated incidents or occasional lapses in attention. They were the pattern, the default way I interacted with my wife, the baseline of our relationship. Surface-level attention, distracted presence, going through the motions of being a husband without actually showing up as one. And I'd been doing this for so long that I didn't even recognize it as a problem anymore. It had become normal, just how we were, the background hum of our marriage that I'd stopped questioning. Our therapist, who we started seeing a few months after this conversation, after Taylor basically gave me an ultimatum about getting professional help or watching our marriage continue its slow-motion collapse, explained it using a metaphor that made everything click into place for me. She said every interaction with your spouse is either a deposit or a withdrawal from your relationship bank account. When Taylor shares something and I give her my full attention, that's a deposit. When she reaches out for connection and I turn toward her instead of away, that's a deposit. When I notice something about her day and ask about it without being prompted, that's a deposit. But when I'm scrolling through my phone while she's talking, that's a withdrawal. When I respond to her excitement with minimal interest or generic platitudes, that's a withdrawal. When I miss important moments because I'm not paying attention, because I'm prioritizing something else, that's a withdrawal. And here's the thing about bank accounts, whether they're financial or emotional, if you keep making withdrawals without deposits, eventually you go bankrupt. That's where Taylor and I were. Emotionally bankrupt. Our account was so far in the red that even if I'd started making deposits immediately, it would have taken months just to get back to zero, let alone build up a positive balance. So that's the story of what I now think of as the master's thesis disaster. The moment I finally saw what I'd been doing to my marriage for years, how systematically I'd been checking out from the person I'd promised to share my life with. Understanding the problem was only the first step, though. The real question became, what do you actually do about it? How do you reverse years of accumulated neglect and disconnection? Let's talk about what this researcher, his name is John Gottman, runs something called the Love Lab out in Seattle, what he actually discovered when he started rigging apartments with cameras and heart rate monitors and tracking every mundane interaction between married couples. Because this isn't just touchy-feely relationship advice cooked up by someone with a couch and an opinion. This is actual science, uncomfortable science that reveals how marriages actually work, rather than how we think they should work, or how we wish they worked. Gottman brought couples into what amounts to a fully surveilled apartment and just observed them existing together, making breakfast, discussing their day, navigating disagreements, all the ordinary detritus of married life. Measuring heart rates, tracking facial expressions, recording every interaction like some kind of relational anthropologist documenting a previously undiscovered tribe. Sounds like a nightmare. Honestly, imagine trying to be authentic while knowing someone's analyzing every micro-expression. But what he found was absolutely fascinating. Those bids for connection I mentioned earlier, those tiny attempts at engagement that seem so insignificant you barely register them as important. They happen constantly in most relationships, dozens of times a day if you're actually paying attention. Your wife points at something outside and says, "Look at that, that's a bid." She tells you about a dream she had last night, bid. She reaches for your hand while you're driving, bid. She asks your opinion about something that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, still a bid. These are tiny requests for acknowledgement, for attention, for the simple confirmation that you register her presence as something worth engaging with, rather than just background noise in your life. And here's where it gets interesting, or depressing, depending on your relationship's current state. You can respond to these bids in exactly 3 ways. Turning toward means you actually engage with the bid. She points at something, you look. She tells you about her dream, you ask a question about it. She reaches for your hand, you take it. Simple stuff, nothing requiring advanced degrees in emotional intelligence, just basic human acknowledgement that another person is attempting to connect with you. Turning away means you ignore the bid entirely. Maybe you're genuinely busy, maybe you're distracted, maybe you just don't register it as important enough to pull your attention away from whatever you're doing. The bid goes unanswered, floating out into the void of your shared space where it dissolves into the ambient disappointment of unmet connection attempts. Turning against is active hostility. She points at something and you say, "I'm trying to drive." She tells you about her dream and you respond with, "That's weird," in a tone that makes clear you find it stupid. She reaches for your hand and you pull away. This is the nuclear option of bid responses, the relationship equivalent of not just declining an invitation, but setting it on fire while maintaining eye contact. Now here's what Gottman found when he crunched all this data, when he tracked these couples over years and correlated their bid patterns with their relationship outcomes. The couples who stayed married and reported being happy, not just grimly persisting in their legal partnership, but actually enjoying each other's company, they turned toward bids about 86% of the time. Not perfect, nobody's hitting 100% because we're human beings with finite attention spans and competing demands, but 86%, pretty consistent. The couples who eventually divorced, they turned toward bids only 33% of the time, meaning they missed or ignored about 2/3 of their partner's attempts to connect. Think about that mathematical inversion for a moment. The difference between marriages that thrive and marriages that die isn't about the absence of problems or perfect compatibility or even great communication during conflicts. It's about whether you consistently choose to engage with these tiny moments of potential connection or whether you let them evaporate unanswered. But here's the thing that makes this pattern so insidious, so easy to miss until you're already deep in the hole. One missed bid doesn't destroy anything. That's crucial to understand, because otherwise you'd be paralyzed by anxiety every time you're distracted. 2 missed bids in a row, still not catastrophic. You're not going to demolish your marriage by being preoccupied once or twice or even 100 times. But let's do some deeply depressing math here. Let's say your wife makes 5 bids for connection per day, and that's actually a pretty conservative estimate for most relationships. If you turn away from 80% of them, that's 4 missed connections every single day. 28 per week, 120 per month, about 1,400 per year. 1,400 moments where your wife reached out and encountered absence instead of presence. 1,400 withdrawals from that relational bank account we talked about earlier. This is how marriages die, and I cannot emphasize this enough. They don't die in explosions, they die in slow motion. Through 1,000 tiny moments of disconnection that seem meaningless in isolation but compound over time into this vast architecture of absence. It's like continental drift, imperceptible on a daily basis but capable of creating oceans between landmasses that used to touch. And the truly brutal thing about this pattern is you don't even notice it happening because each individual moment seems insignificant. 1 missed bid is nothing. Who cares if you didn't look at the bird she pointed out? But 1,000 missed bids, 10,000. That's how you end up sitting in different rooms every evening, coordinating logistics through text messages, wondering when your wife became someone you barely recognize. It's like gaining weight. You don't gain 30 pounds in a day. You gain it 1 meal at a time, 1 skipped workout at a time, 1 decision at a time over months and years. And then one day, you step on a scale or see a photo of yourself and wonder what happened, when exactly the change occurred, because you certainly don't remember deciding to let yourself go. Marriage disconnection works precisely the same way. Our therapist, who has this unnerving ability to make you feel simultaneously understood and completely transparent, like she can see straight through whatever defensive posturing you're attempting, she explained this using a different metaphor that actually penetrated my thick skull. She asked me how I'd fix a leaky roof. I'd patch the hole, I said, because I'm a construction project manager and fixing things is literally my job. Right, she said. But what if the leak happened over years? What if the damage was spread across the entire roof in tiny cracks you couldn't see from the ground? Thousands of microscopic failures in the waterproofing that only became visible when you actually got up there and looked. I'd have to fix each crack individually, I said, starting to see where she was going with this. Exactly. Your marriage isn't one big leak that you can patch with one grand gesture. It's thousands of tiny cracks, and you fix them the same way they formed, one at a time, consistently, over whatever time it takes. That's when I finally understood that I couldn't fix our marriage with one amazing vacation or one expensive piece of jewelry or one weekend where I was suddenly super husband. I had to fix it the same way I'd broken it, through small, consistent moments. Except this time the moments would be connection instead of disconnection. Let me tell you about those vacation photos I mentioned at the beginning, because they became this weird talisman for me, this reference point for what we'd lost. About 6 months before the master's thesis disaster, I was looking for something on Taylor's phone with her permission. This wasn't some creepy snooping situation, and I stumbled across pictures from a trip we'd taken 2 years earlier. Weekend getaway to the coast, just the two of us, back when we still occasionally did things that weren't dictated by the kids' schedules or household maintenance requirements. And in every single photo, we were touching, not pose touching, not the kind of contact that happens because someone's taking a picture and you need to look like a couple, but natural contact. My arm around her shoulders, her hand on my chest, fingers intertwined. We were looking at each other instead of at the camera, laughing at inside jokes I couldn't even remember anymore, existing in this bubble of shared enjoyment that seemed impossibly distant from where we were now. I sat there in my truck, different truck than the Home Depot parking lot incident, but same emotional crisis, same sense of trying to understand when exactly everything went wrong, staring at these photos, trying to remember when we'd last touched like that, casually, naturally, without it being a precursor to sex or a perfunctory greeting or some kind of instrumental contact designed to accomplish something. I genuinely couldn't remember. We'd shake hands with strangers more than we touched each other at that point. We'd become roommates who split bills and parenting duties, who coordinated schedules with the efficiency of air traffic controllers, who managed the logistics of our shared life with impressive competence. But we'd forgotten how to be lovers, or even friends, or even two people who enjoyed each other's company beyond our functional partnership. The couple in those photos, they liked each other. You could see it in their body language, in the way they were oriented toward each other, in the genuine smiles that weren't performance for the camera. They enjoyed each other's company, were genuinely interested in what the other person was thinking, found each other amusing and attractive and worth prioritizing. The couple we'd become, we were efficient, functional, good at getting things done. We could coordinate complex schedules, manage 2 kids and 2 careers, maintain a household that looked perfectly fine from the outside. But the spark was gone, the connection was gone, the fundamental friendship that's supposed to underlie romantic partnership was gone. And I'd been so busy managing the logistics of our life that I hadn't noticed we'd lost the actual life we were managing. Those photos planted a seed, not the immediate action kind of seed where I suddenly transformed into an emotionally available husband overnight, but a seed of awareness. of understanding that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, that we'd drifted from who we'd been in ways that weren't just normal relationship evolution. And that if I didn't do something about it, not someday when work calmed down or the kids got older or life became less chaotic, but soon, I was going to lose her. Not through some dramatic blow-up or discovered affair or thrown plate argument that ends with someone moving out, but through continued slow-motion disconnection until one day she'd just be done, emotionally checked out, gone even while still physically present, which is its own particular kind of relationship death, two people haunting the same house like ghosts who used to know each other. So that's the science, that's the research, that's the cold hard data about how marriages actually work in practice. Thousands of tiny moments of connection or disconnection, compounding over time like interest in a bank account, creating either closeness or distance. The question became, what do you actually do about it? How do you reverse years of accumulated neglect when the pattern feels so ingrained it might as well be your personality? Because understanding the problem without having a solution is just sophisticated despair, and I'd had enough despair sitting in various parking lots staring at my phone, wondering how I'd become someone I didn't recognize. Here's what happened after the master's thesis conversation, after Taylor finally articulated what had been obvious to her for years but completely invisible to me. Nothing. For about 3 days, absolutely nothing changed in any observable way. I walked around with this new awareness sitting in my chest like I'd swallowed broken glass, understanding intellectually that I'd been a terrible husband, that our marriage was circling the drain, that something needed to change, but having absolutely no idea where to start, what to do first, how to begin untangling years of accumulated dysfunction. The scope of the problem felt overwhelming in that particular way that makes you want to just crawl back into whatever hole you've been living in, because at least that hole was familiar. Years of disconnection stretching behind us like a wasteland, thousands of missed moments, patterns so deeply ingrained they were basically my operating system at this point. How do you reprogram yourself when the bugs are features you've been running on for a decade? Taylor was the one who suggested therapy, which tells you something about the state of things. The person I'd been systematically neglecting for years had to be the one to say, "We need professional help. I cannot fix this by myself. You are not going to spontaneously develop emotional intelligence through the power of wishful thinking." My first reaction was spectacularly predictable, the kind of masculine resistance to seeking help that's practically encoded in our DNA. "We don't need therapy," I said, like I was some kind of authority on what we needed despite all available evidence suggesting I had no idea what we needed. "We just need to talk more, communicate better, maybe go on a date night or something." As if the problem was a simple communication glitch we could patch with better dialogue and occasional restaurant visits. As if years of emotional neglect could be resolved through improved scheduling and maybe remembering to ask about her day once in a while. Taylor looked at me with this expression I'd come to recognize: patient exhaustion, the face of someone who's explained the same thing 17 different ways and is running out of creative approaches to make you understand. "John, we've been not talking for years. Talking more isn't going to fix patterns we've spent a decade building. We need someone who actually knows what they're doing to help us deconstruct this mess." She was right, obviously, but admitting you need therapy feels like publicly declaring yourself insufficient at this fundamental human task. Like standing up in front of everyone and announcing, "I have failed at the basic requirement of maintaining an intimate relationship and require professional intervention." Our therapist's office smelled like lavender and disappointment, one of those spaces that's been designed to be as non-threatening as possible. All beige walls and comfortable chairs that are probably scientifically calibrated to make you spill your emotional guts. There was a box of tissues positioned strategically on the side table, and that box bothered me more than anything else. The assumption that tears would be shed, that grown adults would sit here and cry about their feelings like it was somehow acceptable to be that vulnerable in front of a stranger. I was determined not to use those tissues, had this whole internal narrative about maintaining composure and handling this like a rational adult. Spoiler, I used those tissues multiple times. Turns out acknowledging you've systematically dismantled your own marriage through years of negligent inattention is surprisingly difficult to do without some kind of emotional spillage. Our therapist asked us to describe our marriage, which seems like a simple enough question until you actually try to do it, until you have to articulate in words what your relationship actually looks like when you strip away all the protective narratives you've been telling yourself. Taylor went first, and listening to her describe our marriage from her perspective was like watching someone perform an autopsy on something I thought was still alive. She talked about feeling invisible, about reaching out and hitting walls, about slowly learning to stop reaching because the rejection of unanswered bids for connection was more painful than just accepting isolation. Her voice was steady, matter of fact, like she was describing someone else's life rather than her own, which was somehow worse than if she'd been crying. The resignation in her tone suggested she'd already done all her crying in private, had already processed the grief of losing the marriage she'd thought she was signing up for. Then our therapist turned to me with this expression that suggested she already knew exactly what I was about to do. "And how would you describe your marriage, John?" I did what I always did when faced with uncomfortable emotions. I built a logical case, constructed a defensive argument based on objective facts that would prove everything was basically fine, and Taylor was perhaps being a bit dramatic. "Look, we have 2 great kids," I said, ticking off points like I was presenting to a client about project status. "We both work hard, the bills are paid, the house is maintained, we don't fight that much compared to other couples I know. I think we're just in a rough patch. All marriages go through this, right? It's normal, it's not like we need some major intervention, we just need to weather the storm." Our therapist let that hang in the air for a moment, let me sit with my own defensive posturing before asking a question that changed everything. Not because it was some profound therapeutic insight, but because it was so simple and obvious that my complete inability to answer it revealed exactly how checked out I'd been. "John, when was the last time you asked Taylor about her inner world? Not about her schedule or what needs to be done around the house or logistics related to the kids, about what she's actually thinking, feeling, hoping for. When did you last express genuine curiosity about who she is beyond her functional roles in your household?" I opened my mouth to answer, fully prepared to provide a recent example that would demonstrate I was in fact an engaged and interested husband. Then I closed it, because I couldn't remember, genuinely could not remember the last time I'd asked Taylor a question about her interior life that wasn't somehow related to logistics or problem solving or coordinating our shared existence. Our therapist gave us homework, which felt vaguely insulting, like we were failing students who needed remedial work in Basic Human Connection 101. The assignment was almost offensively simple. Every day for the next week, I had to ask Taylor one question. What was the best part of your day? Then I had to actually listen to the answer. Not half listen while thinking about other things, not listen while formulating my own response or checking my phone or doing 17 other tasks simultaneously. Just listen. And then ask one follow-up question based on what she said. That's the entire assignment. One question, actual listening, one follow-up. This was what we were paying someone with multiple advanced degrees to tell us. Ask your wife about her day and pay attention to the answer. I left that session thinking this was the biggest waste of time and money since I'd bought that exercise equipment that's now functioning as an expensive clothes rack in our basement. One question a day. That's the solution to years of disconnection, to the systematic dismantling of emotional intimacy, to the 1,000 accumulated wounds of turning away from bids for connection. But Taylor looked at me in the parking lot and said something I'll never forget. Her voice tired, but also containing this edge of ultimatum. "Can you just try it? Without the running commentary in your head about how stupid you think it is, without the defensive posturing, without treating this like some beneath you task. Can you just try?" So I tried it, mostly because the alternative was watching my marriage continue its slow-motion implosion and I'd run out of other ideas. That first evening felt like performance art, like I was an actor who'd forgotten his lines and was trying to improvise his way through a scene he hadn't properly rehearsed. We'd just finished dinner, kids were doing homework at the table, Taylor was loading the dishwasher in that automatic way people do tasks they've performed 10,000 times. I stood there in the kitchen trying to figure out how to ask this question without it sounding completely artificial, without it being obvious I was following therapeutic homework rather than expressing genuine interest. Finally, I just said it, blurted it out before I could overthink it further. "What was the best part of your day?" Taylor looked up from the dishwasher, immediately suspicious in a way that made clear how unusual this question was coming from me. "Why are you asking?" "Because I want to know," I said, which was only partially true. Mostly I was asking because our therapist had assigned it as homework, and I was trying not to get divorced, but there was also some small, genuine curiosity underneath the obligation. She thought about it for a moment, clearly trying to determine whether this was some kind of trap or weird test. Then she said, "I had lunch with a friend from work. We talked about this book we're both reading. It was nice to just talk about ideas instead of schedules and logistics for once." Old John from a week ago, John from the entire previous decade of our marriage, would have said, "That's nice," in that particular tone that means, "I acknowledge you spoke words, but I'm not actually engaging with the content," and then wandered back to whatever I was doing before this interruption. But I was supposed to ask a follow-up question, so I asked, "What book?" which seems like the most basic possible follow-up, like asking what someone had for lunch when they mention eating. But apparently, it was more engagement than Taylor had gotten from me in recent memory. And then something unexpected happened. Her face changed, softened, opened up in a way I hadn't seen in months. She told me about the book, some literary thing I'd never heard of, and she was animated talking about it, using her hands, her eyes lighting up, leaning forward slightly as she explained the plot and what made it interesting and what she and her friend had discussed over lunch. I realized I hadn't seen her this engaged, this present, this visibly enjoying the act of talking about something that mattered to her in months, maybe years. She'd been going through the motions of our shared life while carefully keeping her actual interior world completely separate from me, because I'd trained her over years that I wasn't interested in that world, wasn't paying attention, wasn't really there. We stood in that kitchen for 20 minutes, which doesn't sound like a long time, but felt significant given that most of our recent conversations had been under 90 seconds and exclusively focused on logistics, just talking about a book I had zero interest in reading myself, but watching Taylor talk about something that mattered to her, something that had nothing to do with our household management or our kids or our endless coordination requirements, reminded me of who she was beyond her roles. She wasn't just mum or wife or my life partner or the person who handles these particular household responsibilities. She was Taylor, a complete human being with thoughts and interests and an entire internal landscape I'd stopped exploring years ago, had stopped even acknowledging existed beyond its instrumental utility to our shared life. The kids finished their homework and disappeared upstairs to their rooms, and we kept talking about the book, about reading in general, about what she'd been thinking about lately that had nothing to do with me or our immediate family concerns. It was the longest conversation we'd had in months that wasn't about solving a problem or coordinating a schedule or managing some aspect of our household operations. The second day was less awkward, less performative. I asked the question earlier, right after dinner, instead of waiting around trying to find the perfect moment. What was the best part of your day? She told me about something funny that happened at work, some absurd interaction with a coworker that wouldn't mean anything to anyone outside her office, but was amusing in that mundane work-life kind of way. I asked what the coworker said next, and she elaborated, and we actually laughed together. Genuine laughter at something that wasn't particularly funny, objectively, but became funny in the sharing of it. The third day, she had her answer ready before I even asked, like she'd been thinking about the question, anticipating it. The fourth day, she turned it around and asked me first, "What was the best part of your day?" Which created this reciprocal cycle of actually considering each other's experience instead of just parallel processing our individual survival strategies. By the end of that first week, something had shifted, not dramatically, not movie montage level transformation, where suddenly we were the couple from our vacation photos again. But there was this subtle thaw in the permafrost between us, like the first day of spring, where you can't quite articulate what's different, but something fundamental has changed in the atmospheric pressure. We were having actual conversations again, brief ones, but conversations about things that mattered beyond our operational existence. And here's what I didn't expect: these conversations weren't just good for Taylor, they were good for me. I'd been living in such a narrow bandwidth of experience, this constrictive tunnel of work logistics, problems to solve, tasks to complete, that I'd forgotten there was an entire dimension of human experience beyond pure utility. Thoughts and feelings and observations that didn't serve any instrumental purpose, but enriched existence anyway. At our next therapy session, our therapist asked how the week went with the deceptively simple tone of someone who already knows the answer but wants to hear you articulate it. I told her about the conversations, about the shift I'd noticed in how Taylor responded to me, how she seemed more open, more willing to share things she'd been keeping to herself. She nodded like this was completely expected, completely predictable to anyone who understood basic relationship dynamics, then gave us the second assignment. This one felt harder, required more commitment, more vulnerability. 10 minutes every evening, no phones, no TV, no kids interrupting, no multitasking or background distractions. Just the two of us sitting together, having a conversation, not about logistics or problems or things that needed to be solved or coordinated, just connection for its own sake. My immediate reaction was logistical resistance disguised as practical concern. When are we supposed to do this? We have kids, we have work, we have 17 other responsibilities competing for our attention. We can't just carve out 10 minutes every day like we're living in some fantasy world where time is infinite and demands are optional. Our therapist looked at me with this expression I'd come to recognize, the expression that said she could see straight through my defensive posturing to the fear underneath. "John, you spend 10 minutes scrolling through sports statistics every day. You spend 10 minutes checking work email before bed every night. You can find 10 minutes for your marriage if you decide it's actually a priority rather than something you'll get to when everything else is handled." Brutal, accurate, but brutal. Because she was right. I could find 10 minutes for all kinds of things that were objectively less important than my relationship with the person I'd chosen to build a life with. We started that night, after the kids were in bed, after the dishes were done, after all the immediate demands had been handled or postponed. Taylor and I sat on the couch phones in another room, TV off, just us existing in the same space without the usual buffer of digital distraction or task-oriented activity. The silence was uncomfortable at first, this palpable awkwardness of two people who'd spent years filling every quiet moment with noise, suddenly being forced to just sit with each other. But then Taylor started talking about something that had been on her mind, not a problem that needed solving but just a thought she'd been having about her career. Whether she wanted to keep doing what she was doing, what she might want to do instead, what scared her about making changes, what excited her about the possibilities. I did something I wasn't naturally good at, something that felt almost physically uncomfortable. I listened without immediately jumping to solutions, didn't interrupt with suggestions about how she should handle her career trajectory, didn't try to fix or redirect or problem solve the uncertainty she was expressing, just listened, asked questions when she paused. What appeals to you about that? What would make you feel like the change was worth it? And let her work through her thoughts out loud without trying to shortcut the process with my brilliant solutions. At the end of those 10 minutes, which naturally stretched to 15, then 20, she said something that stuck with me, that made me realize how fundamentally I'd been misunderstanding what she needed from me. Thank you for just listening. I didn't need you to fix anything or tell me what to do. I just needed someone to hear me thinking through this out loud. That's when I finally understood something our therapist had been trying to communicate from the beginning. Most emotional sharing isn't a request for solutions, it's a request for witness. For someone to acknowledge that your interior experience is real and valid, that your thoughts and feelings matter enough for someone else to pay attention to them, to hold space for them without immediately trying to solve them away. We did this every night for 2 weeks, 10 minutes minimum, though the conversations often went longer when we actually got into something interesting. Topics ranged from deep existential stuff to completely trivial observations about things we'd noticed during the day. Future anxieties, childhood memories, random thoughts about movies or books or whatever had caught our attention. The content almost didn't matter. What mattered was the ritual of it, the consistent message it sent. You're important enough for my full attention. Your thoughts matter to me. I'm interested in who you are, not just what you do or how you serve the functional requirements of our household. I see you as a complete human being, rather than just my wife who handles these particular responsibilities. But here's what I learned that was crucial. That changed everything. Those 10-minute conversations weren't enough by themselves. They created a foundation, established this baseline of intentional connection, but the real transformation happened in the micro moments scattered throughout the day. Our therapist introduced this concept in week 3, this idea that major change doesn't happen in big dramatic gestures, but in tiny consistent choices. Micro moments of connection, 5 seconds here, 10 seconds there, dozens of times throughout the day. Bids for connection that I actually turned toward instead of away from, that I engaged with instead of dismissing or minimizing or responding to with distracted half attention. Taylor would show me something on her phone instead of glancing at it while doing something else. I'd stop what I was doing, actually look at it properly, respond with genuine engagement rather than automatic acknowledgement. She'd start telling me a story while I was doing dishes instead of half listening over the sound of running water. I'd turn off the water, face her, give her my full attention for those 2 or 3 minutes it took her to tell the story. She'd mention something she was worried about. Instead of immediately offering solutions or trying to logic away her concern, I'd say, "Tell me more about that," and just listen to her articulate the worry, let it exist without trying to immediately solve it into non-existence. These weren't grand gestures, weren't dramatic demonstrations of renewed commitment. They were barely noticeable adjustments to my behavior, tiny course corrections that would have been invisible to any outside observer. But they accumulated, compounded, created this gradual shift in the relational atmosphere between us. So those were the first changes, the initial interventions that started shifting us away from the edge of whatever cliff we'd been approaching. Simple stuff that felt awkward and forced at first, that required conscious effort and regular reminders because my default patterns kept trying to reassert themselves. But slowly, incrementally, these new patterns started becoming more natural, started requiring less conscious effort, started feeling less like therapeutic homework and more like just how we were with each other. But implementing these changes wasn't smooth, wasn't some linear progression from disconnection to connection. There were setbacks, moments when I completely reverted to old patterns, times when the gap between intention and execution was embarrassingly wide. And how we handled those moments, those failures and regressions, made all the difference between sustained change and just another temporarily unsuccessful attempt at marriage improvement. Here's what nobody tells you about fixing a broken marriage: progress isn't some tidy upward trajectory like those motivational posters in corporate break rooms. It's more like trying to walk a straight line while someone occasionally shoves you sideways, and sometimes that someone is yourself, your own deeply ingrained patterns reasserting themselves with the force of muscle memory. About 3 weeks into our new communication practices, right when I was starting to feel somewhat competent at this whole being present for my wife thing, I had what I can only describe as a complete regression to factory settings. All those micro moments of connection, all that conscious effort to turn toward instead of away, just evaporated like they'd never existed. A major project at work imploded in that spectacular way that only construction projects can, where one problem cascades into 17 other problems like dominoes made of flaming garbage. Contractor issues, supply chain nightmares, a client threatening to pull out and sue for breach of contract. The kind of crisis that consumes every available brain cell, and then starts borrowing from your sleep and basic human functioning reserves. I came home that Tuesday completely fried, operating at maybe 30% capacity, my entire mental bandwidth consumed by damage control scenarios and worst-case financial projections. And Taylor, blissfully unaware that I was one more setback away from a complete nervous breakdown, started telling me about something that had happened with her sister. Some family drama I should have been tracking but honestly had lost the thread on weeks earlier because I'm barely capable of managing my own immediate reality, let alone extended family dynamics. My old patterns kicked in with the smooth automation of a well-maintained machine that's been running the same program for a decade. I grabbed my phone while she was mid-sentence, started scrolling through work emails like they contained the secrets of the universe, made those automatic listening sounds that mean, I register that you're producing words, but I'm not processing their content. Taylor stopped talking, just stopped mid-sentence, her voice cutting off like someone had unplugged her. I didn't even notice for about 10 seconds that's how checked out I was, until the silence became so pronounced, it penetrated my work crisis tunnel vision. Finally looked up from my phone to find her staring at me with this expression I'd learned to recognize over the past few weeks. Not anger exactly, more like weary recognition. The look of someone watching a reformed alcoholic reach for a drink, the face of someone who'd been hoping for change but had prepared themselves for disappointment. "You're doing it again," she said quietly. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that my first instinct was to get defensive, to explain that I'd had a terrible day and couldn't she just give me a break for one evening, to point out that I'd been doing better for weeks and one slip shouldn't negate all that progress. All the classic justifications queuing up in my head like planes waiting for clearance to take off, ready to deploy the full arsenal of defensive posturing that had served me so well for years. But something our therapist had said echoed through the defensive noise, cut through the automatic response pattern trying to reassert itself. The moment you notice the old pattern, you have a choice. You can defend it, justify it, explain why this particular instance is special and doesn't count, or you can acknowledge it and redirect. So I put the phone down, actually put it down on the table, screen down, physically separating myself from the electronic tether that had been more important than my wife for the past however many minutes. "You're right," I said, and those two words felt like lifting something heavy. "I'm sorry. Tell me again what happened with your sister." Taylor looked genuinely surprised, like she'd been preparing for an argument and instead encountered acknowledgement. "It's okay if you're too fried to listen right now," she said, and there was something in her voice, not quite forgiveness but maybe recognition that I was trying. "But don't pretend you're listening when you're not. That's worse than just saying you need space." Which was completely fair, brutally fair actually. That moment taught me something crucial about rebuilding connection. Sometimes the most connecting thing you can do is admit you don't have the capacity to connect right now. Pretending to listen while mentally being somewhere else isn't presence, it's just a more insidious form of absence, one that makes the other person feel crazy for noticing the gap between your words and your attention. "I am completely fried from work," I said, and it felt weirdly vulnerable to just state that plainly rather than pretending to be fine. "Can you give me 30 minutes to decompress in the garage and then I promise I'll actually listen, like really listen, not fake listen while thinking about work." She could work with that. What she couldn't work with, what nobody can work with, is the illusion of presence without actual presence, the puppet show of engagement while the puppeteer has left the building. So I went to the garage for 30 minutes and here's what was different from the old pattern. I wasn't hiding from feelings or avoiding connection. I was genuinely giving myself space to transition from work crisis mode to present husband mode, acknowledging that I needed that buffer rather than pretending I could instantly flip a switch. Then came back, Phone left in the garage like a bad habit I was trying to quit, and actually listened to the family drama saga, which turned out to be more interesting than I expected once I was actually paying attention rather than treating her words as background noise to my internal work panic. That incident revealed something important about the nature of change. Setbacks aren't failures, they're information. Each time I caught myself reverting to old patterns, I learned something about my triggers, about the specific conditions that made me revert to autopilot. Work stress made me withdraw. Fatigue made me fake presence rather than admit I needed space. Feeling overwhelmed made me reach for my phone like some kind of electronic security blanket. Once I started recognizing these patterns, I could work with them instead of being blindly controlled by them. Could notice, oh, I'm really stressed right now, which means I'm going to want to check out, which means I need to be extra conscious about staying present. Not that I always succeeded. Consciousness doesn't automatically equal control, but awareness was the first step toward having actual choice in the matter. About 6 weeks into therapy, we had what Taylor and I now refer to with the kind of dark humor that only comes from surviving something as the Saturday meltdown. It started with a completely mundane disagreement about weekend plans, the kind of low-stakes negotiation that happens in every marriage. She wanted to visit her parents. I wanted to tackle some projects around the house that had been accumulating like dust bunnies in the corners of our to-do list. Normal couple territory, right? The kind of thing you should be able to navigate without requiring professional mediation or drawn-out conflict. Except somehow, through some mysterious alchemy of accumulated resentment and terrible timing, it escalated into a full-blown argument that touched on literally every grievance from the past decade. My work hours that she'd been silently resenting, her relationship with her mother that I'd been silently judging, division of household labor, who sacrificed more for whom, the whole catastrophic inventory of things we'd been carefully not discussing for years. We were both yelling, actually yelling, volume levels we hadn't reached in months, maybe years. All that therapy, all those micro moments of connection, all that conscious effort to be better, and here we were right back in the exact pattern we'd been trying to escape. Fighting not to solve a problem but to win, to prove the other person wrong, to justify our own positions with the kind of aggressive certainty that leaves no room for understanding. Our daughter came downstairs with this worried look on her face, and if you want to understand shame, try seeing your conflict reflected in your child's eyes, and asked if we were getting divorced, which was like having ice water dumped on your head while someone simultaneously punches you in the stomach. We both stopped mid-argument, mid-word probably, assured her we were just having a disagreement and everything was fine, sent her back upstairs with what I hope were convincing parental smiles. Then stood in our kitchen in this awful silence, both breathing hard, both feeling like complete failures, like we'd been climbing out of a hole for weeks only to suddenly discover we'd just been digging ourselves deeper in a slightly different direction. Taylor spoke first, and her voice had this quality I'd rarely heard from her. Not anger or frustration, but something more fundamental, closer to exhaustion with the whole enterprise of us. This is what we do, isn't it? We take one small thing and blow it up into everything we've ever been upset about. Every little disagreement becomes the referendum on our entire relationship. She wasn't wrong. We'd weaponized the entire history of our marriage over a simple weekend planning disagreement, dragged out every grievance from storage and thrown it into the current conflict like we were trying to build the most comprehensive case possible for why the other person was fundamentally failing at this whole partnership thing. I don't want to do this anymore, I said, and I meant it. Not that I didn't want to be married, but that I didn't want to fight this way anymore. Didn't want to keep playing out this destructive pattern where every conflict became existential, where we couldn't just disagree about weekend plans without somehow making it about the fundamental adequacy of our entire relationship. We did something we'd never done before, something that felt vulnerable and weird, but also necessary. Right there in the kitchen, still upset, both feeling raw and exposed, like we'd been emotionally flayed, we sat down at the table and tried to figure out what had just happened, not who was right or wrong, because by that point the original disagreement had been buried under so many layers of accumulated grievance that it barely mattered, but what the fight had actually been about underneath the surface argument. Turned out the weekend plans were never the real issue, which probably won't surprise you, but was genuinely revelatory to us in the moment. I was feeling overwhelmed by an endless list of household repairs I didn't know how to handle, projects that kept multiplying like some kind of home maintenance hydra where fixing one thing revealed 3 other broken things. Taylor was feeling guilty about not seeing her aging parents enough, worried about time passing and opportunities disappearing, carrying this low-grade anxiety about becoming the child who doesn't visit enough. We were both stressed, both feeling inadequate in different ways, both carrying burdens we hadn't articulated to each other, and we turned that stress on each other instead of supporting each other other through it, because apparently that's the default setting in troubled marriages. Your partner becomes the problem rather than your teammate in solving problems. That fight, and specifically how we recovered from it, how we didn't let it fester for days or weeks but actually tried to understand what had happened, taught us something crucial about the difference between fighting to win and fighting to understand. The goal wasn't to never have conflicts, because any two humans trying to coordinate their lives will inevitably have conflicts. The goal was to fight differently, to catch ourselves when we started escalating, to remember we were supposedly on the same team even when we disagreed. Now I need to tell you about what actually changed long term, because knowing how to handle setbacks is one thing, but building sustainable new patterns that don't require constant white-knuckle effort is another entirely. The real question became, how do you make these changes stick when the novelty wears off and real life continues to be messy and demanding and occasionally overwhelming? Here's the problem with most relationship advice, most self-help interventions, most therapeutic homework assignments. They work brilliantly for about 3 weeks while you're still operating on the novelty high of trying something new. Then real life reasserts itself with the persistent inevitability of weeds in a garden, and suddenly maintaining these new patterns feels like one more exhausting task on an already overwhelming list. I was acutely aware of this dynamic about 2 months into our therapy work, right around the time when the conscious effort required to stay present was starting to feel unsustainable. Like running a marathon where someone keeps moving the finish line further away every time you think you're getting close. How long could I maintain this level of intentional presence before I burned out and reverted to autopilot? Our therapist anticipated this question before I asked it, which was either impressive intuition or just experience with the predictable trajectory of couples attempting to rebuild connection. The goal isn't to white-knuckle your way through being present forever, she said during one session. The goal is to practice these patterns until they become automatic, until turning toward instead of away becomes your default setting, rather than something requiring constant conscious effort. Which sounds great in theory, just practice, until it's automatic, like learning to drive or touch type or any other skill that eventually becomes second nature. Except relationship patterns are complicated by the fact that you're not just reprogramming yourself, you're participating in a dynamic system with another person who has their own patterns and triggers and ways of being that interact with yours in unpredictable ways. Still, certain things did start becoming easier through sheer repetition. That nightly 10-minute conversation, which had felt so forced and artificial initially, like bad community theater where everyone's forgotten their lines, gradually became just what we did. Not a therapeutic assignment requiring conscious effort, but simply part of our evening routine, as automatic as brushing teeth or checking that the doors were locked. The question, what was the best part of your day, transformed from homework to habit somewhere around the 6-week mark. I stopped having to remind myself to ask it, stopped having to consciously think about turning toward Taylor's bids for connection. My default response pattern was slowly, incrementally shifting from scroll phone while making listening sounds to actually engage with what she's saying. What I didn't anticipate, what genuinely surprised me in a way that few things do, after 40 years of supposedly learning how life works, was how much better I felt once these patterns became established. Not in some abstract my marriage is healthier way, though obviously that too, but in concrete daily terms. I was less stressed, slept better, felt less of that ambient anxiety that had been my constant companion for years. Turns out constantly turning away from your spouse creates this low-grade relational tension that you carry everywhere, this background noise of disconnection that affects everything else even when you're not consciously aware of it. Like living next to a highway, eventually you stop noticing the traffic sounds, but they're still affecting your nervous system, still creating stress responses even when you've habituated to the noise. When that tension dissolved, when Taylor and I started actually connecting instead of just coordinating, I had mental bandwidth I didn't know I'd been missing. Work was less overwhelming because I wasn't also carrying the weight of a failing marriage. Parenting was easier because Taylor and I were functioning as an actual team rather than two separate entities managing logistics through occasional status updates. 87:15, the physical reconnection. Something else shifted that I hadn't expected, something I'd basically stopped thinking about because it seemed like a lost cause. Physical intimacy started happening again. Not because we scheduled it or had some big conversation about our sex life or implemented relationship advice about keeping the spark alive. It just emerged naturally once we were actually connecting emotionally. We'd gone from barely touching except for perfunctory kisses goodbye, to casually touching throughout the day, her hand on my shoulder while I was making coffee, me putting my arm around her while we watched TV, holding hands while walking to the car. Small physical contacts that weren't leading anywhere, weren't instrumental to anything, just expressions of affection between two people who'd remembered they actually liked each other. And that casual physical connection created this foundation where sexual intimacy stopped feeling like another task on the to-do list and started feeling like a natural extension of the connection we were building in every other area. We went from maybe twice a month scheduled, perfunctory, more about relieving tension than actual intimacy, to several times a week, spontaneous, genuinely connected. But here's what mattered more than the sex. Though admittedly the sex was a nice bonus, we started liking each other again. Sounds basic, almost embarrassingly simple, but somewhere in the logistics management and parental duties and household maintenance, we'd stopped being friends, stopped genuinely enjoying each other's company beyond our functional partnership. Taylor would say something funny and I'd actually laugh. Not the polite acknowledgement laugh you give your co-worker's mediocre joke, but genuine amusement at something my wife said. We started having inside jokes again, references to shared experiences that would make us both crack up for reasons that wouldn't make sense to anyone else. Saturday mornings became this ritual where we'd have coffee together before the kids got up, not discussing schedules or problems, just talking about whatever was on our minds, reading parts of articles to each other, sharing observations about the neighborhood drama unfolding across the street. Completely ordinary moments that felt significant precisely because they were ordinary, because we were choosing to spend this time together rather than retreating to our separate corners. I need to be clear about something though, because I don't want to paint this as some fairy tale transformation where everything became perfect and we lived happily ever after like the credits just rolled on our marital struggles. We still have hard days, still have moments where I revert to old patterns, where Taylor gets frustrated with me, where we have to consciously redirect ourselves back to the practices that work. Just last week I caught myself in the garage at 9 p.m, ostensibly organizing tools but really just hiding from a conversation Taylor had tried to start about her mother's declining health. Old John in all his glory, retreating to the emotional bunker when feelings got uncomfortable. Except this time, I noticed what I was doing after about 20 minutes instead of after 6 months, and I went back inside and actually had the conversation. That's the difference, not that I never revert to old patterns, but that I notice faster, recover quicker, have the tools to redirect myself before small disconnections compound into massive chasms. We're not perfect at this, not even close, but we're so much better than we were 2 years ago that sometimes I barely recognize the couple we used to be. Our marriage now looks like two people who are actually partners, who genuinely like each other, who choose to turn toward each other more often than away. We still have disagreements. Just last month had a legitimate argument about finances that got heated before we caught ourselves and shifted into actual problem solving, rather than defensive position taking. But conflicts don't spiral into existential referendums on our entire relationship anymore. We can disagree about something specific without making it about everything. Taylor hums while watering her plants again, which sounds like a trivial detail but represents something fundamental about the state of our relationship. She's happy in our home, in our life together, in ways that manifest in these small, unguarded moments of contentment. And I notice those moments now, register them as significant rather than letting them pass unacknowledged. Last month she finished a painting first complete piece she'd done since before the kids were born, and showed it to me with this nervous excitement, like she wasn't sure how I'd respond. I put down my phone without being asked, really looked at it, asked her about the composition and what inspired certain elements and what it felt like to be creating again. We talked about her painting for 20 minutes while dinner got slightly overcooked, and it was worth it. That 20-minute conversation was worth 1,000 perfect meals eaten in silence. If you take nothing else from this entire lengthy discourse about my marriage nearly imploding and the painstaking work of rebuilding it, take this: your relationship isn't dying because of the big dramatic problems you can point to and name. It's dying in the tiny moments you're not paying attention to, in the 1,000 small disconnections that seem insignificant individually but compound into catastrophic distance over time. The solution isn't grand gestures or expensive interventions, or waiting for the perfect moment when life calms down enough for you to finally focus on your marriage. The solution is turning toward instead of away, today, in the small moments that seem too insignificant to matter but actually constitute the entire fabric of your relationship. Ask your wife what the best part of her day was, then actually listen to the answer. That's it. That's where you start. Not tomorrow, not when things settle down, not when you feel more emotionally prepared. Today, right now. One question: genuine attention, one follow-up that demonstrates you actually heard what she said. Everything I've shared about my marriage, the disconnection, the wake-up calls, the painstaking work of rebuilding, it all started with recognizing one fundamental truth. Emotional neglect was killing my relationship more effectively than any dramatic problem could have. The invisible marriage killer isn't infidelity or financial stress or incompatibility. It's the accumulated weight of thousands of moments where you chose something else over genuine connection with your spouse. Now, I want to leave you with something practical, something you can do today that has the potential to start shifting things in your marriage, even if you feel like strangers right now. I promised you at the beginning that I'd give you one question you could ask today, not tomorrow, not when things calm down, but today, that has the power to restart connection, even if your marriage feels dead in the water. Here it is, and I warn you that it's going to seem almost offensively simple given everything we've discussed. What was the best part of your day? That's the question. 5 words that don't require advanced degrees in psychology, or perfect emotional attunement, or any specialized skills beyond basic human curiosity. Just asking your wife about her actual experience, rather than her functional status, her interior life, rather than her to-do list completion rate. Here's why this particular question is powerful, rather than just another surface-level conversation starter. It does several things simultaneously that most questions don't accomplish. First, it communicates that you care about her experience beyond its utility to your shared logistics. You're not asking about her day to assess whether she handled the things she was supposed to handle. You're asking because you're genuinely interested in what brought her joy, or satisfaction, or even just mild contentment. Second, it's positively framed. You're not asking what went wrong, or what problems need solving, or what's stressing her out. You're asking her to identify something good, which requires her to reflect on her day and find the bright spots rather than dwelling exclusively on difficulties. This isn't toxic positivity or pretending problems don't exist. It's just creating space for acknowledging that good things happen even in difficult days. Third, and this is crucial, it opens the door for actual conversation rather than closing it with a yes or no answer. How was your day? Gets you fine, or busy, or some other generic placeholder. What was the best part of your day? Requires actual thought, actual engagement, actual sharing of specific experience. But here's the part that makes this question actually transformative. Instead of just another empty ritual, you have to follow it up with genuine curiosity based on what she tells you. If she says the best part of her day was a conversation with a friend, you ask what they talked about. If she says it was finishing a work project, you ask what made it satisfying to complete. If she says it was a quiet moment drinking coffee before the chaos of the day started, you ask what she was thinking about during that moment. The follow-up question is where the magic happens, where you demonstrate that you're not just checking a box labeled "Ask Wife About Day," but actually engaging with her interior experience. And here's what's important. You're not following up to gather information you'll use for some purpose, not trying to solve problems or offer advice unless explicitly requested. You're following up because you're genuinely curious about the person you married, about what she thinks and feels and experiences. Which brings us to the hardest part of this entire exercise, the component that will require the most conscious effort. If you've spent years practicing distracted pseudo-presence like I had, you actually have to listen to her answer. Not half listen while thinking about work or checking your phone or planning what you're going to say next. Actually listen with your full attention focused on understanding what she's communicating. Put your phone down, turn off the TV, stop whatever task you're performing. Make eye contact, use your actual human ears and brain to process the words she's saying and the emotional content underneath those words. I know this sounds like kindergarten-level instruction, but apparently those of us with Y chromosomes need remedial training in basic attentive presence because we've somehow convinced ourselves that we can effectively listen while simultaneously performing 17 other tasks. You cannot. I don't care how good you think you are at multitasking, you're not actually listening if you're also scrolling through your phone or watching TV or mentally composing your fantasy football lineup. Your wife can tell the difference between real presence and performed presence, even if you think you're fooling her with appropriate nodding and periodic sounds. Start tonight, not tomorrow, not next week when you've mentally prepared yourself. Tonight when you get home, or when you see your wife next, or whenever the first reasonable opportunity presents itself. Ask the question, listen to the answer. Ask a follow-up, listen to that answer. That's the entire assignment. 5 to 10 minutes of genuine attention, which you can absolutely carve out of your evening even if you think you're too busy or too tired or too distracted by other concerns. Do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, 7 days minimum, because one conversation isn't going to reverse years of accumulated disconnection, but 7 consecutive days of genuine attention will start creating a pattern. will start sending the message that you're actually paying attention now, that something has shifted in your approach to the relationship. Fair warning, your wife might be suspicious at first, especially if you've spent months or years systematically turning away from her bids for connection. She might respond with skepticism or defensiveness or those one-word answers designed to test whether you're actually interested or just performing interest as part of some temporary campaign before reverting to your usual patterns. Don't let that derail you. Keep showing up, keep asking, keep genuinely listening. Consistency is what rebuilds trust, not perfect execution in any single moment. She needs to see that this isn't just another 3-day burst of effort before you return to your regularly scheduled programming of distracted absence. You might also encounter resistance from yourself, from your own ingrained patterns that want to reassert themselves. You'll forget to ask some days. You'll catch yourself half listening while thinking about other things. You'll want to immediately jump to problem solving rather than just witnessing her experience. That's all normal, all expected, all part of the process of learning new patterns after years of reinforcing old ones. This one question is obviously not the complete solution to whatever distance has developed in your marriage. It's not going to magically fix years of accumulated resentment or repair broken trust or resolve whatever specific issues you're facing. But it's a starting point, a first small step toward rebuilding connection that's accessible and actionable today, rather than requiring months of preparation or perfect conditions. Think of it like the first stone in building a path alone. It doesn't get you anywhere, but it establishes direction and makes the next stone easier to place. Each day you show up, each day you genuinely engage, each day you choose connection over distraction, you're placing another stone. Eventually those stones become a path that leads somewhere worth going. If this approach resonates with you, if you're recognizing your own marriage in the patterns I've described, I want you to know there's more help available. I've created a full audio course called How to Fix a Marriage on the Brink of Divorce that goes much deeper into the specific strategies that saved my marriage with Taylor. We cover communication techniques, rebuilding trust after betrayal or neglect, rekindling both emotional and physical intimacy, and creating sustainable patterns that don't require constant white-knuckle effort. The course is $9 less than you'd spend on lunch, infinitely less than you'd spend on divorce attorneys, and it's specifically designed for men who want practical, actionable guidance rather than theoretical relationship concepts that sound good but don't translate to real-world application. You can find the link in the description below. I've also got other courses that address specific marriage challenges, financial stress, parenting without destroying your partnership, handling in-law drama, keeping your marriage strong in the digital age. Each one targets a particular pain point with concrete strategies you can implement immediately. Again, links are in the description if any of those specific issues resonate with your current situation. I'm John Gates, and 2 years ago, I was sitting in a Home Depot parking lot at 10:30 p.m., holding a receipt for cabinet hinges I didn't need, wondering how my marriage had become this polite arrangement between two people who barely spoke beyond logistics coordination. Today, Taylor and I have a relationship I would have thought was impossible 2 years ago. Genuine friendship, consistent connection, the kind of partnership we both thought we were signing up for when we got married. That transformation didn't happen through grand gestures or expensive interventions or perfectly executed relationship strategies. It happened through thousands of small moments where I chose connection over distraction, where I turned toward instead of away, where I showed up consistently even when it required conscious effort. Your marriage can change too, but only if you start today, not tomorrow, not when life calms down, not when you feel more prepared today. Ask your wife what the best part of her day was. Actually listen to her answer. Ask a follow-up question. Do it again tomorrow. That's how you begin reversing the invisible marriage killer, one small moment of genuine connection at a time. Good luck, and thank you for sticking with me through this entire lengthy exploration of how I nearly destroyed my marriage and what I learned in the process of putting it back together. One more thing before you go, and I promise this is the last ask, then you're free to get on with your day and hopefully ask your wife about hers. If any of this resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding along thinking, yeah, that's exactly what I've been doing wrong, or if you just want to hear more stories about how I systematically dismantled my marriage through oblivious incompetence and then had to painstakingly rebuild it, hit that subscribe button below. I'm putting out more content about marriage recovery, practical relationship strategies that don't require you to suddenly become some emotionally enlightened guru, just a slightly less oblivious version of yourself. Real talk about the messy, uncomfortable work of fixing relationships, told by someone who's still figuring it out rather than someone who's got it all solved and is now dispensing wisdom from some imaginary mountaintop of relationship perfection. I'm also on Instagram, Facebook, and whatever other social media platforms are currently relevant. Links are in the description below, because apparently we live in an age where content has to exist simultaneously across 17 different platforms, or it doesn't count as real. You'll find shorter pieces there, quick observations, bite-sized advice for when you don't have time for hour-long videos about my emotional dysfunction. The description also has links to all the audio courses I mentioned, the full marriage recovery course, the specific ones about communication, intimacy, financial stress, parenting, all of it. Everything I've learned through therapy, through research, through trial and catastrophic error, packaged into formats you can actually use rather than just theoretical concepts that sound good but don't translate to three-dimensional reality. Alright, that's actually it now. Go ask your wife about her day. I'll be here making more videos about relationship disasters and recovery, and apparently talking to a camera about my personal failures has become my primary hobby. See you in the next one.